can go ahead and get started. I could just say to the folks that are here that welcome to our first Research Skills 101. And Herbert has kindly volunteered to give us this really wonderful, detailed, informative presentation about research grant proposals. And if anybody here has suggestions about other topics we should cover, we're planning to do one once a month. So with that, I'll let Herbert take it away.
Good morning. And what Erika left out is this is an exquisitely boring topic. You need to make a significant effort to prop your eyelids open. Budgets are boring, but they are very, very necessary. You really can't get a grant without a well-written budget. Now, this is review material. If you know nothing about doing grants and budgets, etc., you have a lot of studying to do, and you have to keep doing it. Okay, the rules are very complex, and what we're going to just talk about today is a simple subset of the very complex rules for U.S. federally funded research grant proposals. Each federal agency has its own rules. The information I'm going to give you here relates with three agencies I'm familiar with: the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and the U.S. Department of Energy. For any specific proposal, you need to be sure to read and comply with the most recent rules for the specific agency to which the proposal is being directed. It changes rapidly without notice. And you must remember, you don't get to simply prepare a grant and send it to an agency. The grant submission, the formal grant submission, has to go through your institution, their own institute, and has to go through its sponsored research office. You have a lot of responsibility for a grant. You need to prepare the grant. You're going to need to execute on the grant, but submitting the grant is the responsibility of the institution. Okay. I'm going to tell you there are 3 layers of rules. There are actually many, many more, but there's at least 3. You need to have the grant proposal solicitation that's relevant to what you're submitting. You need to follow the agency-specific proposal submission rules and a weird, recently invented thing called Federal Uniform Guidance. It used to be that every agency had its own set of general rules on grants, and now there's supposed to be something to make it uniform called the Federal Uniform Guidance. You need the grant solicitations. Where do you get them? Well, one place you can get them is the agency websites. You can also search through all of them. And on one site, grants.gov. You used to search for grants on a thing called Commerce Business Daily. That actually still exists. But the place you're supposed to look now is grants.gov. Now, you need to also get yourself into the system for whatever agency you're applying to. And what you need to be into in terms of being in that system varies with the agency. For the National Science Foundation, you need fastlane.nsf.gov, research.gov, and login.gov. The National Institutes of Health, you need era.commons.nih.gov and login.gov. For the Department of Energy, in theory, you only need grants.gov and login.gov, but there is a website for the Department of Energy's Office of Science. If you would like to avoid a lot of screwing up, make sure you go to that website if you're applying to the Department of Energy. Now, the agency-specific rules that you have to comply with for the National Science Foundation are the NSF Proposal and Award Policies Guide, PAPPG. And no, I did not invent an extra P in there. It really is, that's called PAPPG. Okay? And I gave you the URL for that. National Institutes of Health, they have their application guide in grants.nih.gov. So this grant says how to apply application guide.html. And the Department of Energy has science.osti.gov grants, policy, and guidance. You must read them, and it's not a matter of read only once. They keep changing. The overall federal budget rules are in the Code of Federal Regulations 2 CFR 200. Now, that supposedly gives you the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal award. That's actually not quite the truth. You still have all the agency-specific stuff, and they don't all agree. If you have read all of them recently, reread them. Each time you prepare a new proposal, I have never in my life, and I've done a lot of grants, I have never in my life had 2 consecutive grants go in under exactly the same set of rules. They keep changing. Now, here is a fudged outline of all the components of an NSF budget. The other agencies have similar requirements of things that you put into their budgets, but you have to read their specific rules. We're going to do this in terms of the NSF breakdown because it teaches you the major elements. But don't forget, you read the rules for the solicitation, you read the rules for the agency, and you do what they say. We're going to go through things which are senior personnel and other personnel, fringe benefits, equipment, travel, participant support costs, other direct costs, which will break down materials and supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to total a thing called direct costs. But there's going to be another thing called indirect costs. Direct and indirect costs are the major division of your budget. Some things, you simply write the budget, I'm going to spend this much and this much on that. Other things are called either burden or overhead, and the current term for it is facilities and administrative, F&A. These are all names for the same thing. These are costs which formally are not one clear thing you are buying. They're for a common or joint purpose. They benefit more than what's called one cost objective. And they're not readily assignable to the things that specifically benefited without an effort disproportionate to the results obtained. So certain kinds of expenses are pooled together, they're aggregated. And an institution can have more than one F&A pool of things that go together. The organization, subject to the approval of the federal government, not you, not the principal investigator, decides what costs are properly handled as indirect costs and how they are calculated. Most commonly, indirect costs are computed as a percentage of what's called modified total direct costs. The 2 categories of direct costs that are left out in most cases from modified total direct costs are equipment and participant costs. The current Ronan Institute F&A rate is 25.5% of modified total direct costs. There are some proposed solicitations from some agencies that require different, and that usually means lower, F&A rates. When you encounter a solicitation which talks about things like that, make sure you talk early to the sponsored research office as to whether that can or cannot be done at the Ronan Institute. There's also another item which is also computed as a percentage, but at the Ronan Institute, it's a direct cost. It's not an F&A. It's called fringe benefits. You pay people's salaries. When you pay people's salaries, in most cases, there also have to be payroll taxes. Sometimes there'll be retirement plan contributions or other things that come in, which basically are costs to the institution, but go directly in the paycheck to the person. At the Ronan Institute, fringe benefits are currently computed at 25% of salaries. By the way, in case you're not familiar with what things are like at other institutions, Both the numbers I'm giving you, the 25.5% for FNA and the 25% for fringe, are low numbers compared to most other places. It actually helps in terms of but budgeting money for a grant is mainly going to the grant. Now, you can do your first year of your grant usually pretty straightforwardly from the things you know at the time you're putting in the grant. You can estimate your costs reasonably well. It gets harder and harder the more you go into what are called the out years, years after the first year. Salaries tend to rise. Even if there were no inflation, salaries tend to increase. That people tend to have more of a value in the marketplace the more skilled and experienced they become. But if there's inflation, basically everything tends to go up with time. Travel, equipment, materials, and supplies, they tend to rise. Now, if you have clear year-by-year estimates of costs that you're sure are not going to get impacted by inflation and other things, certainly you use these good estimates. But in writing your budget, you need to do some reasonable allowance for the things you are not absolutely sure of, and that is usually a percentage every year that things are going to go up, called escalation. In case you've been following the news, at the moment we have a thing called inflation. The target on inflation is 2%. It's not that right now. And I don't know what it will be by the end of this year. I certainly don't know what it will be next year. Nobody does. But you still have to write your budgets. You have to make an estimate. Okay? So you make an estimate on escalation. Right now, in terms of escalation for the coming year, I would guess at about 3%. And the target is to get down to 2%. I doubt they're going to make it. Okay? Now, salaries. Salaries are hard. The rules for it are 2 CFR 200.430. In most grants, salaries tend to be a major budget component. And there are strict, complex grant budget rules for them. NSF is one of the tightest on this. The NSF has a 2-month salary limit. The NSF normally will not fund a proposal that asks for more than 2 months of salary per year for any senior personnel summed across all NSF awards to that person. If the sound performance of the project requires more than 2 months, you have to make a case. And you may not win that case. I've lost on that. Okay. I'm still going to try again, but you need to make a case. You have to explain in what's called the budget justification why this salary should exceed the 2-month limit. Don't just ignore it. Okay? And it has to be related to the work, not simply, well, I'd like it. There has to be a definite benefit to the funding agency in granting this exception. The NIH does not have the 2-month limit. The NIH has a congressionally imposed salary cap. Right now, that cap is $203,700 base salary. That doesn't mean you can do $203,700 in 1 month. Okay, that means if the person is, all their compensation over the year is $203,700, and you divide by 12, that's the amount you can do in a month. Okay. Salaries may be based on hourly compensation, biweekly compensation, monthly compensation, 9-month academic year employment, 12-month calendar year employment, et cetera, et cetera. But for each individual, they have to be reasonable, they have to be consistent with the laws and the written institutional policies. You'll have a hard time ever justifying salary reflecting more than 100% effort. And institutions differ on what they consider 100% effort. NSF tends to only believe 11 months of a year can be effort. NIH will accept the idea of 12 months of a year being effort, but neither one is going to let you go over 100%. Okay? Both of them believe that a month is 160 hours of effort. If you have an unusual salary request, you want to do something strange that doesn't fit within sort of the norm that's equivalent to what goes on in schools. That's what most agencies are used to.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Um, could you explain, you mentioned the NSF doing sort of 2 hours, two months of the year, 2 months of the 12 months calendar year, but you've also mentioned an 11-month effort. Could you explain the relation between those two, what the two mean?
NSF tends not to believe that people will continue working without taking some vacation every year.
So that's the 11th.
They actually assume that in most cases they're dealing with people who are in academic years, that they are, this is where the 2-month actually comes from. They assume an academic employment that was based on a 9-month academic year, 2 months additional work during the summer outside their academic employment, and 1 month vacation. That's where the 2 months comes from. It no longer is required to be summer months, but they still have this limit of 2 months in a year, unless you can make a case why it's in the NSF's interests, not yours, the NSF's interests, for them to be paying more than 2 months, because they don't believe you're actually going to do it.
So this is basically funding for outside your academic place, for those months that you're not doing the work in the institution.
It is for people who are on a 9-month salary.
I see.
You must be so employed. And some people at the Ronan Institute actually do happen to be, on 9 months. Some people have to be on 12 months.
Yeah.
Your employment needs to be something, the case for which is made independent of the grant.
I see. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
You are somebody who is worth so much and so much per month or per hour or per day or per whatever, for reasons that exist independent of the grant. That clear?
Yes, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
All right. All right. As I said, you can't go more than 100% effort, and a month is 160 hours. Discuss any salary requests that are unusual with the sponsored research office. Now, I'm going to tell you about equipment, but I'll get to the punchline before I tell you the details, which is, in most cases, you would be well advised to avoid trying to include equipment in a research grant. Formally, the definition of equipment is tangible personal property, including information technology systems, having a useful life of more than a year, and a per unit acquisition cost, which equals or exceeds the lesser of the capitalization level established by the, quote, non-federal entity, that's their own institute, for financial statement purposes, that means accounting, or $5,000. In other words, if you're hunkering after a mass spectrometer or something or whatever, some large piece of equipment, and the cost of that item is $5,000 or more, that goes on the equipment line. It's considered capital equipment. It's capital expenditure, governed by a set of rules under 200 439. Depending upon the agency you're applying to, there may be much more strict rules. The rules of the Department of Energy on equipment are basically derived from what's required to run a nuclear submarine, and are extraordinarily strict. I've lived through them. They are royal pain. Now, the Ronan Institute would have the option of creating a lower limit than 5,000 at which things are classified as capital. My advice is stay away from it unless there's a very good grant reason for doing it. And what a lot of people do is, if they do have something which involves equipment, they do separate grant proposals on equipment, just for the equipment. But you need to speak to the sponsored research office and work out exactly what you're going to do, because it involves a lot of work. Dealing with equipment is a major burden. It is one of the things for which the word burden for overhead makes a lot of sense. Hey, travel. Well, until we had the pandemic, travel was fairly easy to estimate. For a large number of years, I would estimate about 2,000 for a domestic trip, 3,000 for a foreign trip, and most of the time I would tend to be right. Right now, it's very hard to do. You still have to do it. Yeah, in most cases, there are very good grant reasons why you should travel somewhere to do something that relates to the grant. So you want to put that in. The division between domestic and foreign travel is no longer as strict as it used to be. But the practical reality is that you probably should estimate more for foreign travel than for domestic. And most agencies have a jaundiced eye towards foreign travel. You need to justify it. Again, in terms of the benefit to the agency, not you. Okay? You get to include both local and long distance transportation, lodging and meals, and there are a few other things like registration fees that go into travel budgets. Normally, lodging is done as actual costs, and meals and incidental expenses are done using what's called a per diem. You can look on the GSA website for their rules on per diem. The State Department, you look for their rules. The GSA applies to domestic travel. The State Department applies to foreign travel. And you need to follow those rules. You cheat on your travel, and they can come after you years later and take the money back. Don't do it. You really don't want to deal with government auditors. They really have a jaundiced eye towards people who are pocketing money that they don't think belongs to them. And the only thing they think belongs to you are what is covered by the rules and by the grant and was done with proper documentation with what's called an audit trail. There has to be paper they can look at up to 5 years after the fact to justify the expenditures. Ever been through a tax audit? Grant audits are just as onerous. Okay. Now, there's a thing called participation.
Another question, if I can, on the travel. I've only just started going to attending conferences and so forth again, and attended a couple last year, but they were all online. And I guess going into the future, we don't know which necessarily in advance which conferences are going to be online and which one's going to be in person.
Yes, it's a terrible. I just got back from a trip to Portland, which was the first face-to-face conference I'd done in quite a while. And I will be totally amazed if the travel paper where they put it. In this particular case, the travel paperwork went into Brookhaven National Lab rather than to the Rowan Institute, but I'll be totally amazed if it just sails through. Okay? We all have to get used to doing this again. This is hard.
Have you got any advice on how to estimate which are likely to be online and which you're going to have to ask for funding for?
Yeah, I got a fortune teller handy. This is very hard. Okay. All right. My wife just asked a good related question. Since it is very hard to do the estimates, that means you will tend to overestimate on your travel. And as the grant progresses, you will have extra travel money in your budget, which you didn't spend because you got locked out. What you can do with most government agencies is as a grant progresses, you look at the state at which you are burning things. It's called the burn rate, okay? And you make requests to reprogram money appropriately for the purposes of the grant. So, for example, during the pandemic, I, in fact, reprogrammed some travel money to be used for other purposes. You have to fit within the rules of the Rowan Institute and that agency on things that you're doing. You need to consult with John and Erika on what you may or may not reprogram to what, and then the funding agency needs to approve what you're doing. Sometimes things are covered by what are called local authorities, which means the decision stops with John and Erika. Not always, and they could always change their mind. and you want to make sure that there's a good paper trail and you're bulletproof, etc. But nobody knows what's going to happen in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, etc., with respect to travel money. And a lot of travel money is going to get reprogrammed. And in a lot of cases, people are going to come with sudden supplemental requests for additional travel money because suddenly things are happening that have to happen face to face. And which it is, I don't know. My crystal ball doesn't exist. My closest approximation to a crystal ball is my wife. Makes much better guesses about the future than I do. Okay, now we're on a thing called participant support costs. I'm gonna get to the bottom line of participant support costs like I did on equipment, which is avoid them if at all possible. Okay. If the proposal involves conferences or training for participants other than Ronan Institute employees, costs are allowable, but they're excluded from the cost basis for calculating overhead. Or there's a reduced overhead for participants. You have to read the solicitation. You have to be very careful on this. For NIH, they really don't like participant support costs. Okay? It's only allowable when identified in the specific grant solicitation, funding opportunity announcement. It's not easy. In some cases, it's worse than travel, because you're doing things like travel budgets for for an unknown number of people who are going to show up at a conference. I've done it. It's very entertaining. Okay? If you can avoid it, avoid it. If you need to do it, you're going to have long, heartfelt conversations with your sponsored research office, with the funding agency, etc., come to some reasonable compromise. And in the end, you're going to end up either short of money or having to reprogram in excess. It's hard. A good place to find what the currently best rules are to do exactly what I did in that second paragraph on this slide. Go to another school which has a lot of grant activity and look up their rules and recommendations. This one happens to be Harvard's. Materials and supplies. In some senses, it's a slush fund. You're being very non-specific. You know you're going to consume something, usually per active participant in the grant. You don't know how much. You need to make estimates. You need to do it honestly. You can't play games on this. The purchasing can't be to your favorite relative and giving them a cut. It must be arm's length, honestly done. Okay? Now, you can charge them as direct costs. Computing devices are allowable. Okay? They even have the ability to do a little bit of allocation that a computing device needs to be purchased and not all of it is going to be used for this grant. Whatever you need to do, you make sure there's a really clear written record as to why these things were needed for the purposes of the grant and what happened to them. Now, if you are on good terms with the federal agencies involved, they will sometimes lend you equipment. I have at times had a few $100,000 of Department of Energy equipment. You need to be very careful track of it, and you don't include a charge in the grant for stuff that the federal government is giving you. You don't double bill for anything. Okay? Publications. Your grant is worthless if the research doesn't get out, and the government's getting more and more strict about this. So you need to publish or otherwise disseminate what you're doing under the grant. Costs are down sharply. They're generally not zero, The set of rules are in 2 CFR 200-461. Really, really important. Don't forget to do this. Everything you do that is a product of the grant should include a citation to the grant. So it's very, very clear. Anyone looks at it, who paid for it? Gives a really warm, fuzzy feeling to your funding agency if they see credits to the grant, okay? And a good allowable cost these days is to pay open access fees, so that not only is the research out there, it's sustainably out there. People can keep getting at it. It's a very useful thing to do. Okay. Now we come to consultant services. Another tricky area. People do need to make use of other people belonging to other institutions and sometimes, pay them something. Perfectly reasonable thing to be doing, but figuring out the cost to be reasonable is hard. You need to do all the appropriate paperwork, and a very important determination you need to make for each and every consultant is whether it would be more in the interest of the funding agency, not you, not the Rowan Institute, the funding agency, for the consultant to have been directly employed rather than contracted with as a consultant. If you're getting the message that these people are unfriendly and suspicious, they're not. They're not unfriendly and suspicious. They're on your side. They want you to succeed, but they don't want you misusing the funds. So you need to proactively adopt the attitude of you are going to protect the interests of the government. They sense this culture of compliance. They feel good about you. If they get the sense that you're Donald Trump and are trying to pocket things and walk off with them, then they're going to get unfriendly and suspicious. Okay. Computer services. Right now, I'm not aware of any particular direct chargeable Rowan Institute computer services. It might happen. Just be very, very careful that you don't try and include within a grant budget a direct charge for something that's also in an F&A cost pool. Okay. There are cases where direct charges could be broken out for some reason, but be careful. Subawards. It will very often happen that more than one institution is collaborating on a research project. There are two structures for doing this. The simple one that all funding agencies will allow is that one of the institutions does the grant award to the funding grant proposal to the funding agency, and the other institutions do a subcontract to that institution. The problem with this, called a subaward, is that the lead institution has to pay each of the subaward institutions their direct costs and their F&A. Therefore, the lead institution sees the F&A for the sub-institutions as a direct cost to them, and they put a F&A on that. This is not terribly popular if it gets out of hand. Within reason, it's fine. NSF is the only institution I know of that has a really clean structure for doing multiple awards in parallel that are linked together so that F&A is just done to each institution directly. And the funding agency sends the money on to each. It doesn't do a pass through you. You need to be very careful on this. You need to consult with the sponsored research office if you're trying to set up something involving multiple linked proposals. NSF at the moment, as I said, appears to be the only one that is doing those, but they do it. It takes extra time to do, but it definitely helps in terms of the budget. and also helps in terms, actually in terms of the administration. It works better. Now, you will see on the budget forms from almost any institution a thing called fee. The reason that's there is small businesses are allowed to have grant proposals to federal agencies under a thing called SBIR and STTR. In these, they are allowed to charge something that's equivalent to a profit of 7 to 11%. And don't start drooling at the 11%. They almost always only allow the 7%. Okay? They, allow that end. But formally, it's 7 to 11%. And it's called a fee, not called a profit, but that's what it is. It's profit for the small business in engaging in the business of doing something that the funding agency seems useful. It is possible for there to be a collaboration involving a small business as the lead institution on STTR and the Ronin Institute providing what amount to consulting services on doing the necessary research. Perfectly fine thing to do. But you must bear in mind that even though one partner in this is going to have a fee on their budget, the Ronin Institute can't. No fee in the Ronin Institute budget. Okay. Cost sharing. This is problematic. Some grant programs require cost sharing or matching. Voluntary cost sharing is strongly discouraged. When I say strongly discouraged, I mean really don't do it. It's not appropriate to voluntarily forgo all or part of the FNA unless it's mandated in the solicitation. Some grant proposal solicitations do require matching and cost sharing or limit FNA. No, means zero, no dollars of federal funds can be used to do that matching or cost sharing. You need to talk to the sponsored research if this comes up in a solicitation. There are things that can be arranged with respect to mandatory cost sharing. Don't try and do voluntary cost sharing. You can't simply say, I want a better chance of getting this through. We're going to give up the FNA. You can say, my friend over there really likes working on this. He's going to work on it for free, and I'm going to put that in the budget as cost sharing. You're only allowed to follow very, very limited rules in terms of having what are called unfunded collaborators. You are allowed to do it, but the rules are really, really tight on how you can do it. NSF rules basically limit you to saying very, very little about the qualities and virtues of the collaborator, and they are not allowed to give you an endorsement letter. Really, really tricky. So if it comes up, consult with the sponsored research office. Do not simply assume you can do it. You can't. Okay? All right. You must write a document that documents and justifies everything in sufficient detail to allow a reviewer to understand why what you're doing is reasonable and necessary to the purpose of the proposal. Your budget justification is a very, very important document. And there are cases where you're forbidden to write it. NIH has a set of rules where instead you write what's called a personnel justification, and you don't get to justify the budget. It's very strange, okay? You have to read the rules. You can't just make them up. And my thanks to my wife for careful copy editing and helpful suggestions. I think we have now chewed up about twice the time I was supposed to chew up, but we still have time for questions. Okay? So, questions?